Dear colleagues, it's 1 p.m. I think we might as well consider starting our next session, the role of social media in propaganda strategies. My name is Natalia Khanenko-Friesen. I'm the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. If you have joined us just now, welcome. So I'll start with our first speaker. Marta Dechuk is an associate professor in the Department of History and Political Science at Western University, London, Ontario, and a fellow at the University of Toronto Monk School of Global Affairs, and also an adjunct professor at Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. She got her doctorate from Oxford University. She's a well-published author, a commentator. We all read interviews and publications frequently. About her recent books are 2024's publication Ukraine, Not the Ukraine. Just prior to that, another book was titled Ukraine's Euromaidan, Broadcasting Through Information Wars with Hromadske Radio. That was 2016. And a year before, Marta had produced yet another book, Ukraine 20 Years After Independence, Assessments, Perspectives, Challenges. Dechuk's current research is on war and social media. She also researches mass media, memory, migration, history, and she regularly provides media commentary. Marta's presentation is titled Russia's All-Out War is Changing Social Media Usage in Ukraine. Next is Dr. Anatoly Gruzd, a co-director of the Social Media Lab, Canada Research Chair, and professor at the School of Information Technology Management, Toronto Metropolitan University. A computational science, social science researcher, Anatoly explores how social media is changing the ways in which people and organizations communicate, collaborate, and disseminate misinformation. His expertise lies in studying online communities and social networks and developing new computational methods and tools to study public discourse on social media in different domains. Gruzd's innovative approach to studying social media had led him to be named a Canada Research Chair in 2015, and he was also inducted into the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars a few years later. Welcome to the session. Our first presenter is Marta, and then I will announce the second presentation just before it will start.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and I would like to thank our organizer, Professor Pankiev, who brought us together here with this amazing collection of scholars. We're all here to talk about Russian disinformation, misinformation. We're looking at information warfare. Now, as a historian, as a political scientist who's been studying Ukraine's media for a number of years, my perspective is a little bit more broad than the specifics of analyzing particular data. Something I think we should all remember is that information is a key dimension of every war. And information warfare, which is what we're talking about today, is as old as war itself. We sometimes get a little focused on the topic we're studying, and we forget that information warfare is absolutely nothing new. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we're looking at strategies of how to cope with information warfare. What is new is the use of social media. When Russia escalated its war against Ukraine and launched that full-scale invasion, a number of people started writing about the fact that we are seeing the beginning of social media warfare. And again, every time there's a new technology, the world thinks, okay, well, everything has dramatically changed. So what I'd like you to keep in mind is, yes, there are changes. The technology, social media, has radically transformed information warfare. But when the telegraph was invented, that also radically transformed information warfare. When television was invented, that radically transformed. So every time there's a new technology, there's a radical transformation. So what we're going to be looking at today in my presentation and my esteemed colleague and various others is what is it about social media that is different from the other transformations that have happened. When I saw this social media is transforming the warfare, I thought I need to study this phenomenon. So I launched a pilot study asking a very basic research question. The research question was basically, how is social media transforming information warfare in the Russo-Ukrainian War? It's a very general question. I'm not testing a theory. I am looking. It's a deductive method. It's like what's out there, and then I will analyze it. So the methodology that I adopted is I thought I will speak to the experts. I will conduct qualitative, in-depth interviews with people who are working in the field and can give me some insight into what is actually happening. I was fortunate enough to get some research funding from my university, and I did 2 research trips to Kyiv in the summer of 2023 and the summer of 2024, during which time I was able to conduct 22 in-depth interviews. And the majority of the people I spoke to are journalists and media managers. So there were 13 of those. I spoke to government officials working in this sphere and analysts, because there are many people in Ukraine who are studying this phenomenon, so I thought I will speak to the experts. And here are the people that I interviewed over those 2 summers, and you will see some of these faces again. So what are my preliminary findings? And this is the first time that I'm presenting this. I will be interested in your comments, suggestions, and feedback, and I haven't finished working with all of the interviews, so this is very preliminary. The short answer is it's a very complex picture. We tend to think propaganda and information warfare is pretty black and white. It's not. It's very complicated. The other big takeaway is what's happening in Ukraine is part of what's happening in global trends. We tend to sometimes look at Ukraine in isolation. The Russo-Ukrainian War is in some ways a unique phenomenon. We don't have a war between Canada and the US, but a lot of the trends that we're seeing in Ukraine's social media and media landscape overall is something that we're seeing in many other countries. So those are the preliminary findings. The most dramatic change that everybody talked about is when Russia escalated its war against Ukraine, there is a dramatic increase in the use of social media. Those of you who've been following media developments in Ukraine will not be surprised that social media usage in Ukraine has been growing as it has been globally. But what happens in February 2022 is a sharp change. And Diana Dudzik, who is founder and the director of the Ukrainian Institute of Media and Communications. She also is a professor at the Mohila School of Journalism. We have 2 colleagues from the School of Journalism here with us who will be speaking later. She put it really, really well. She just said that audiences abruptly moved to the use of social media and primarily Telegram, because their institute monitors media patterns throughout Ukraine. And she said, on that day, we saw this spike. And what happened previously is television was the #1 source of media information in Ukraine. The internet was on second position usually, online media, social media, and so on. Social media goes up to #1, and Telegram, which is a particular social media platform, which our next presentation is all about, that becomes the #1 source of information and news for Ukrainians. The question is why? Why do people suddenly switch to social media, and why do they move to Telegram? What Diana told me, and other respondents repeated this, is that was where information was available for them. The information they were looking for was not available as quickly in legacy media outlets. So television, radio, online media were not providing information as quickly, nor were government sources. Where the information was in social media networks. And this was the kind of information people needed, is where are the troops coming, where are the bombs falling? That is where people started going. And it was Telegram that most information was being circulated through. So that's a quick answer to why. So now we know what's happening. Ukrainians are going to Telegram to get information they need for survival, first and foremost. So social media becomes a useful tool for information. But we all know social media it's an instrument. And Yaroslav Yurchyshin, who is the head of the Parliamentary Committee on Freedom of Speech, he put this really well, I thought, and that's why I'm quoting him here. Social media is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it provides information quickly. On the other hand, it is a means for disseminating disinformation. So it's not one or the other, it is both. The other thing that came through in the interviews is social media has many roles and functions. I've talked about information, and a lot of respondents said this information people were getting through these social media networks, again, primarily through Telegram. That's how they survived very often, is because they were getting that information quickly. It was also a means of sharing information. So not just receiving information, but also sharing it with peers. So that's the communication aspect. Are you doing okay? How are you? That was moving much more quickly through social media networks than anything else. Documentation. This is something, I'm not sure if we have a panel on this or a paper on this or not in this conference, but social media became an important instrument in documenting the war and things like war crimes. Because people all over the country, in the occupied territories, they were taking pictures and they were sharing them on social media. And that created a wonderful base of documents that people like Natalia, she's running a project called the Reckoning Project, and various others that are collecting all of this data. Military significance. This was something I hadn't actually anticipated. But the military, both Ukrainian and Russian, and this is something we heard earlier today, they used a lot of the material from social media for their own purposes. So they could track movements and behaviors because people were posting. Now, this changed over time, and people learned that you shouldn't be posting certain things on social media, but it still remains a major source of information for militaries. It's a mechanism for donations. Many of you probably in this room have done this. You have a fundraiser on Facebook or some other media platform. Means of resistance. Something, again, that I hadn't thought about, but the Yellow Ribbon Campaign, which some of you know, that's how they circulate their resistance, is through social media, because they can't do it any other way. And mobilization. So that's another function role. When we talk about social media, again, sometimes we think of it as this big category, right? Social media. But there are lots of different social media platforms, and they don't all operate the same, and they don't all have the same function. And this was, again, something that came through in a lot of the interviews. Now, I don't know how many people in this room use Telegram. I do not. I hadn't even heard about it until 24 February 2022 when I started reading about it. People in Canada don't use Telegram. I'm sure most of you either have used or are using Twitter/X, Facebook. So if you look at all the different social media platforms that exist, they play different functions and different roles. And what I found particularly interesting is how people in Ukraine use certain social media platforms to communicate with each other and others to communicate with the outside world. So Serhiy Lashchenko said, yeah, I use WhatsApp and Twitter to talk to my friends abroad, but I can't remember what he said, to talk to my friends here. So the different platforms are used for different reasons, and again, there's a lot of data. Telegram. Now this is the one that I have done least work on because so many other people are doing, and you're going to hear about it in depth. But what I find fascinating about Telegram, it's the most popular. And when I asked why, it's because there are no filters, and technically it works better than any other social media platform in conditions of war. You know, when the internet is weak, Telegram will still work. Some of the other social media platforms don't work very well, but Telegram always does. And also, it handles huge traffic. So you can upload videos, you can upload all sorts of content that others don't. And the most important thing is there are no restrictions. You can post anything you want. The thing that my respondents are all aware of, but users don't always stop to think, is the ownership, and I'm going to get to that. But the creator and owner of this is the Russian-born Pavel Durov, who was arrested by the French for his role in organized crime online. So keep that in mind. And Telegram, what I've discovered, as with so many other platforms, there's this dual reality that exists. That on the one hand, this has become, as Vlad Bundash, who's a journalist with Hromadske Radio, said, this is the news feed. This is where everybody is putting their information, that's where everybody's getting their information. So there's no question about the fact that this is the number one. At the same time, this is the main source of disinformation. And Darina Shevchenko, she's from the Kyiv Independent, she put it beautifully. It's a haven for disinformation. So these are the two realities. On the positive side, we talked about disinformation. Most people in Ukraine have learned to distinguish between false news and real news through trial and error for the most part. What has been happening, the efforts to combat misinformation, disinformation, there have been many programs in media literacy on all levels. What started happening is attempt to regulate these social media platforms. And this is where it gets interesting and complicated. The challenges of trying to regulate social media platforms is something that is not unique to Ukraine. You've probably been following the discussions about TikTok use in the US and in Canada. When you have a social media platform that is owned by a country that is mining the data and we don't know what's happening with it, which is precisely the reality with Telegram, how do you regulate it? Well, through legislation. Legislation takes time. It's a very slow process. It's not a quick instrument. The owners of the social media platforms that are used in Ukraine, they're all foreign. None of the social media platforms being used in Ukraine are owned by Ukrainians. So it's difficult to regulate international companies. When television was the #1 news source in Ukraine, the major television companies were Ukrainian. And the Ukrainian government could exercise effort to regulate what they were doing. This is not the story with social media companies. Enforcement. Even if you do regulate, because there's a law that's being discussed now to regulate social media, how do you enforce it? There are very few mechanisms available to Ukrainians. And then what Serhiy Leshchenko said, anytime you try to regulate anything in the media sphere, everybody's talking about censorship. These are 3 people I talked to last summer about this issue of regulation. Ola Herasimyuk, she is the head of the National Broadcasting Council. It's like CRTC, it's the regulator. Yaroslav Yurchyshin, he is the head of the Committee of Free Speech in Parliament. Mykola Knyazhitsky, he's a journalist and also a member of parliament. And Mykola has initiated a piece of legislation to regulate social media and specifically Telegram that he's putting through parliament. It has not yet been adopted. But all 3 of them said the difficulty is there are no instruments in place to actually regulate because the National Council for Broadcasting, it has no authority over social media. That institution needs to be revised in order to give it authority. The obstacles to regulation are tremendous. And the journalists on the ground, they are very aware of this. That they, as Ukrainians, as individuals, as media outlets, they're helpless against the tech giants. And Ihor Ruskladai, who works as an analyst, explained this to me in great detail, that the social media platforms that are regulated, so there's those like Telegram that have no regulation, so that's a different category altogether, but there are some social media platforms that do have regulation. And Facebook, although now they don't regulate either, but they used to have regulation on what is acceptable content, what is not acceptable content. However, this turned out to be problematic for a lot of Ukrainians because those criteria are universal. Ukraine is in a war. So, certain types of images are considered unacceptable. When you have a photograph of somebody who's been tortured, that is unacceptable. You are violating the rules of Facebook and you're banned. And once you're banned, it's very difficult to get unbanned. And what do? Well, Facebook does not have an office in Ukraine. So you have to write to the Facebook office somewhere else and try to get the ban lifted and explain that you are documenting a war crime. You are not violating. So these types of issues are the reality for people in Ukraine. The trust paradox. This is something I'm working on, and this is, I can't figure out the correct, like where I'm going to go with this, so I'm just going to put it on the table and then look for some feedback. A lot of people don't trust social media networks, but everybody uses them. And this is particularly for Telegram. Government officials will share information on Telegram, even though they know it's not secure, and it's more than likely being shared with the FSB. And they continue to share sensitive data through Telegram. I don't get it. This is a very respectable journalist, and he says the same thing. He's like, you know, there's no restrictions on what I can do. This is a fast source of information. And I heard this over and over and over again. The only one who said something different was Kyiv Post. They have a Telegram channel. Follow us on our Telegram channel. Kyiv Independent. Here's something that happened, and how do we know about it? Well, we saw about it on this Telegram channel. They use it all the time. The trends. All my students use TikTok, even though they know who owns it, and they know that their data might be given over to a government that is not particularly friendly to them. So what's happening in Ukraine is not specific to Ukraine. There are issues of political economy, ownership. Who owns these social media platforms? That's the people who control them. How is the landscape changing? The media landscape, the information landscape as a result of social media becoming the #1 source of information for Ukrainians. I'm going to leave you with 3 quotes. You're going to love these. Denis Bihus, he is probably Ukraine's top investigative journalist. I love this quote. I said, so where are we going? What do you see? And he said, we're heading for an apocalyptic information inferno. And I think he's right. And these are all the things he outlines. The components of where we're going with all of this. Serhiy Lashchenko, former journalist, he's now working as an information advisor for President Zelensky. He's one of the people who helps him curate his daily messages. Very different perspective. He said he was looking beyond the war. The war's going to end, so what's going to happen afterwards? Ukraine's media landscape's going to dramatically change. Television, already not #1. But the ownership structures will change dramatically as a result of this. So that was his view, and again, I think he's right. And the last quote, Andriy Kulikov, who is a co-founder of Hromadske Radio, he's looking at the relationship between social media and legacy media and owners and politicians. And what he's saying, and again, I think he's spot on, is politicians and media moguls, those tech giants, they have manipulated us so they don't have, like, social media is so much cheaper than setting up these media empires of the past. And that's why people like Pinchuk is not going to be spending money on television anymore, because social media is less expensive and it's much more powerful. So this is something to think about. Thank you very much for your attention.
Our next speaker, Dr. Grust, with his presentation titled Mapping the Spread of Kremlin's Propaganda and Disinformation on Telegram.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone, and thank you, Marta. It's half of my job introducing why we need to study Telegram. As a computational social scientist, I'm gonna dive right into data. There will be a lot of charts, just a heads up, don't be scared. I'll try to walk you through them, and it is complex area, then that's necessitate complex and mixed method approaches to study it. Hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be a bit of experts in data visualizations and particular methods called network analysis that helping us to understand this information space and some of the cyber threats that exist on Telegram, but also other platforms. I'm Natalia, I'm professor and Canada Research Chair at Toronto Metropolitan University. I'm also co-director of the Social Media Lab. This is us. We are interdisciplinary center where we study how people, organizations use social media for various purposes. And so they track the research stream of how mis and disinformation is being shared online and how social media being weaponized is one of our priority areas. So when the full-scale invasion started, we, being in Canada, we're concerned that Canadians are exposed to Russian narratives about the Russia-Ukraine war. So we conducted a nationally representative survey with Canadians asking them, have you seen such and such narratives? Do you believe in them? And so we try to identify what are the vulnerable parts of our population in Canada. Even though we're quite far geographically, we just click away from Kremlin's propaganda and misinformation online. So what we found that, yes, indeed, Canadians, at least half of them said they were exposed to Kremlin narratives. And concerning 30%, so 1/3 of our survey, we had 1,500 Canadians, they actually believe to some extent that it was Ukraine who is the aggressor. So just think about it, 1/3 of our respondents across Canada. What also was concerning that when we control for all the factors, people who on the far right side of political spectrum were more likely to believe in Kremlin's narratives. Yes, there is a bit of a self-selection bias when somebody already predisposed to believe in certain narratives, they are seeking them out online. But we also did find that individuals, regardless of their party affiliations or prior beliefs, they relied on social media for news about Russia-Ukraine war. They are more likely to believe in some of the Russian narratives. So then we said, well, if that's the case, how can we protect, to inform Canadians and others about some of those misleading, false claims coming from Kremlin elsewhere? Well, we tested different intervention strategies. And so one approach stood out for us was this called soft moderation technique. So you know how hard moderation, meaning social media platform will block an account, Marta referenced some of it, or they will remove your message. So and social media platforms don't like to do that. So soft moderation is the opposite of it. The message, the account will remain, but the platform will put some kind of label at the bottom, or they will put a screen on top of the graphic image saying that, hey, based on professionally fact-checked information, the information in this post is potentially false or misleading. So we conducted another experiment with 1,500 Canadians. What we discovered that by having just a small informational label at the bottom of the message, not even covering the message, reduce engagement with pro-Kremlin narratives by 66%. So fact-checking helps, and adding little labels at the bottom does help to inform Canadians and others online. But the problem, of course, we know that platforms now going away from saying they're not going to be fact-checking, they're not going to be partnering with professional fact-checker, and they are claiming that crowdsourcing will help, but it doesn't. And I'm really looking forward to a presentation actually tomorrow. So Victoria Romaniuk, who is from Ukrainian fact-checking organization, Victoria, somewhere here you are, hi. So she will be telling you, I'm curious to hear about your work on Stop Fakes and some of the challenges you experience. But anyway, so the bottom line that we need to be vigilant, because even within Canadian society, quite a few of Canadians exposed to, and some of them believe to Kremlin mis and disinformation. And so this brings us to today's project, where we're looking at the Telegram, which is, as Marta tells us, quite prominent platform both in Ukraine and Russia, as well as elsewhere. If you haven't used Telegram, it's helpful to compare it to Facebook. So while you can DM, like send direct messages on Telegram, uses just a regular messaging app, most popular features is essentially a Telegram channel or Telegram group. A channel, it's like Facebook page where you have organization or individual creating a page and everybody follow that page. So that's your Telegram channel. And the other popular affordance is Telegram groups, just like what the name suggests. You join a group, could be up to 200, or could be a larger group. It can be public or private groups, and then you can post and comment on other people's content. So that just gives you a bit of background. To study something like Telegram, first you have to collect the data in a systematic way. Of course, you can try to kind of collect as much as you can, but you're going to waste a lot of resources if you try to collect everything. So in our work, we decided to have a very purposeful data collection strategy. I'll tell you about that as well. I heard some of the questions this morning. Those of you, especially students who are interested in this research area, getting into it, asking what kind of methods, tools you're using. So there are lots of computational tools you use, but first you do need a platform that has a publicly facing mechanism for researchers and developers to collect and analyze data, at least publicly available. So fortunately from research side, Telegram has that mechanism. It's called API, Application Programmable Interface. But because everybody can access it, we have to assume, even regardless the fact that, which is important information that who owns the platform, but even regardless that Russians also have the information we have about Telegram. So keep that in mind. But anyway, long story short, there are lots of technology going into the data collection analysis. If you're interested in the space but don't have technical skills, at the Social Media Lab, we're also developing tools like the one mentioned here on the right side called Communalytic, that can help you collect data from Telegram and do your own analysis on narratives or networks. So now let me tell you a little bit about purposeful sampling I mentioned earlier. It starts actually by selecting specific accounts, channels in our case, and groups that we know in advance talk about Russia-Ukraine war. So when the full-scale invasion started, we look at different listings, different information, and compile a list of 177 channels and groups that were popular at the time and only discussed Russia-Ukraine war on the Russian and Ukrainian side. And then what you do, you kind of follow breadcrumbs. You see what they post and what links they share or what other channels they reposted messages from. And you start creating this kind of network by following the breadcrumbs. You follow in the same way people would share information on the platform and communicate. And over time, over multiple iterations, in our case it was 5 iterations, this network grew from the green dots visually represented here, those are seed channels and groups, to more and more added channels. So that's kind of, we're trying to map that particular targeted area of Telegram that we are interested in studying. So in a network sense, each dot here is a channel or group, and connection will represent some form of communication. I love presentation by Professor Friedman this morning where he used this metaphor of collage to understand information space. So in our work, we're using a network principles to understand information space. So this is an example of how those breadcrumbs, those information pathways are discovered. Let's say this infamous account, Donbas Gdevishka, and by the way, one of the moderators for this account was a former military, US military, and so what this account does right now is linking to, in this example, to the Russian news channel, RIA News, but you can see the news is actually in Russian, but they are kind of translating to American audience, essentially the same information, propagating to their own network. So essentially by knowing that this Donbas Devishka channel linked to the other channel, RIA News, it helps us to recreate that information pathways from channel A, Donbas Devishka, to RIA News. Another example of its feature of Telegram is one can forward the message. You don't have to actually write a text, you can just repost it, and it's called forwarding. So that also helps us to create and kind of reconstruct how information travels through this network. In this case, the same account reshares news from another channel called Missiles and Nukes, and this is for context. It was when first time Kyiv using Patriot, he essentially shut down Kinzhal ballistic missile that nobody believed it's possible. Russian didn't believe it, and so what they're doing here, this Missiles and Nukes channel, kind of disproving, saying, well, actually Kyiv didn't really shut it down. It's all a fake. And so the Donbas Devishka forwarded that particular video and messages. So by following this again breadcrumbs, we're developing this information communication network that helps us to understand who are the most influential channels and groups on Telegram, and who might be influencing others, and in what region of the world. Because you saw sometimes they're in Russian, sometimes in English. With this network, we can also answer questions like, is there a direct or indirect information pathway between a channel that Zelensky has on Telegram and a news aggregator, popular news aggregator in Russia, BB Breaking? Normally you'll say, well, how is it possible? There's no way BB Breaking would be like aggregating something Zelensky said. Well, at least not directly. But in fact, we did find that there is a direction. There's a 10 degrees of separation. You know that famous Milgram study where it found all people in the world connected like by 5.6 degrees of separation? Well, on social media, usually there are 3 degrees of separation. So 10 degrees of separation is quite far, but what more important is, where's that interface? Who is the bridging agent that converts information that coming from Ukrainian side of Telegram, in this case, channel from Zelensky, and goes to Russian spaces and vice versa. So that was critical. So just by looking at this exercise, we label going through this channel, we label in green color, those were like Russian or pro-Russian accounts, and you travel until you reach the account we label in like light blue color, critical of Kremlin. So essentially it's Medusa publication, alternative news that was blocked by Russia. And so that was the connecting piece, the bridging agent in this case, because after that you go into the pro-Ukrainian news channel and then the Zelensky's account. So while some may be skeptical of anything like alternative to Kremlin, whether it's fake or not, or opposition to Kremlin, so I understand those feelings, those are legitimate concerns. Here, this simple example does demonstrate the important role of those type of entities being a bridging agent if they have true, honest intentions. Now, from this one example, pathways, now we kind of zooming out to see this busy network visualization. I'm laughing because we're in this National Art Center here, and the networks always impress me for the artistic side, but they're actually quite informative if you know how to read them. So I'll just quickly walk you through some of the basic principles because we can then learn practical insights. Practical insight about the Telegram use by Russia and Ukraine. So what we see here, each dot, they're very small dots. Those are Telegram channels and groups directly or indirectly involved in the discussion about Russia-Ukraine war. What algorithm software we use does essentially adds a color automatically to the groups of nodes, groups of channels and groups that tend to reshare each other's information. So imagine we have this audience here, we have one group of chairs here, you will be one cluster, one color, and the rest of the chairs, because you closer to each other and you can whisper to each other, you in this other cluster. So that helps us to map the Telegram into the subgroupings. And in fact, I labeled those groupings for you. Number one here in pink, and when you look at the legend, it says Ukrainian and pro-Ukrainian channels, and there are about 15% of all accounts in that group. So this is the largest category, but let's not be misled. Ukrainians are not the largest stakeholder or representatives on Telegram, even though that cluster happened to be the largest in terms of percentages. The rest of the clusters are Russian or pro-Russian. So in fact, you have to flip it to say that only 15% of that space really friendly or pro-Ukrainian or Ukrainian information space. So it is quite hostile environment, and so if you are unknowingly coming to Telegram expecting to find reliable, credible news about Russia-Ukraine war, well, more likely you're going to end up in other parts of this Russian side of this Telegram. I'm not advising that at all. Next, we can then also dive deeper into the Russian side, where we can see this large in the center, this blue color, cluster number 3, pro-Kremlin military bloggers. So those are, accounts that often repost on the ground military updates, and they're tightly connected with Russian news organizations like RIA News and in the green cluster just on top of it. And then you on the peripheries on cluster 5 and especially and 8, those are your regional channels from different areas, oblasts in Russia. So they are kind of rebroadcasting whatever that central nodes, military bloggers and RIA News and type reposts. So it's kind of propagates from the central nodes and everybody else just follow, share the same content. In fact, so this slide, and by the way, I put some QR codes so you can follow the QR code. I have a link directly to our website, and I'm happy to share slides after the presentation as well. The work we do uses publicly available information, and as Academic Lab, we want to inform the public so all the data and information is available. But if you don't get QR code, it's on our website. It's called conflictmisinfo, one word, conflictmisinfo.org. So all that content is there as well. I just really finished it last night. So it's like you first people to see it, and it's quite informative. So let me tell you why. So altogether, for the last 3 years, we collected over 300 million messages from Telegram on this topic and over 30,000 channels and groups. So who has time to read 300 million messages to understand it. No, I don't. And even with automatic techniques like topic modeling, they tend to come up with very obvious observations, not quite helpful. So what we did here, we used our network I showed you earlier, and we measured the influence, how many times a channel been referenced by other channels, how often it's been used as a source, information source for the other channels. And we ranked them because we had data for 3 years. We had measured their ranking in periods of 6 months. So we have 6 different timestamps. What we can see on the left side, very small font there, those are names of the channels. The number 1 channel that most reference in this network, RIA News, I mentioned earlier, state-owned Russian news and quotes agency. But you can see they were consistently, for each 6 months for the last 3 years, they consistently ranked number 1. So whatever they post means everybody on Telegram will repost. So you don't need to read messages from 30,000 channels on Telegram. If you follow RIA News, you're already getting very good coverage of understanding what's important. Then you have a bunch of military bloggers. So essentially the accounts, the top 10 accounts where you have a straight line, it means they're consistently keeping their rank, top 10. The only changes starting like after the 10 accounts, some channels will drop in rank, so the lines will go down. And what's interesting to look at this type of charts to see what are the new information sources in Russian Telegram space emerging. So something we want to investigate because, like I said, this is we just built based on fresh data yesterday. But this channel at the left, you can see the line should straight up. So they used to be ranked 38, and now they're like in number 12. That's a huge jump. The other channels that jumped a lot, it's a kind of news aggregator. It's called Pool One. So this is a Belarusian channel. So clearly, as the war continues, Belarus becoming more important state and actor in the physical and information space. And that can be reflected by the fact that their news aggregator is gaining importance in this environment. So finally, we want to also see not just the one that are most impactful channels, like the one I mentioned earlier, like RIA News and some of the military bloggers, but also those who are on the periphery. We already talked about that pink color, that Ukrainian cluster, where they are on the periphery and means they don't dominate the information space. But what's more concerning is that when we look at English language, verified channel, so there's such a thing on Telegram that you can have a blue check marks that actually means you verified, you have like a Wikipedia references, you have a Western media published about you, so there's a kind of gives you a sign of credibility. So all these highlighted notes, those are channels that are posted in English and they're verified. While they are on the periphery, it's understandable, not a lot in Canada, US using them, but many of them are far-right influencers in Canada and the US. And in fact, some of them allegedly took money from pro-Russian propaganda outlets to promote Kremlin narratives. We know that much. And so you can see they are quite active here. And yes, this is just one information space, but they're also active on YouTube and other places. But this is one place you can discover that interface between how the information or misinformation starts from RIA News and similar channels at the core of this network, propagates towards those peripheries and then transform to other audiences like the English-speaking far-right audiences in Canada and the US. In conclusion, I want to bring back that there are many different actors in this Telegram network that require our attention. So we talk about those central nodes, we talk about nodes that are verified English language, but there are also a lot of non-verified channels that also gain popularity and write in English to English audiences, including those embassy accounts. I was fascinated by earlier Professor Friedman presenting some of their work on those embassy accounts. So I think that deserves additional studies because this is the type of what they post indicates what they're paying attention to. And the example here, I'm showing you Russian embassy in Canada, in Ottawa here, and they were posting a couple years ago this rainbow flag cross out and kind of posting this provocative message that family is between men and women. They are paying attention to Canadian society. They know what are the fault lines, what are the sensitive topics that they can take advantage of to polarize our society. And so going back to that survey I mentioned earlier we conducted, where 30% of Canadians think that, to some extent, that Ukraine was the aggressor in the Russia-Ukraine war. So let's not forget that, because they are paying attention to that 30%. And we tend to live in our information bubbles. So there's outside world, and the work never stops. So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you, Marta. Thank you, Anatoly, for timely and absolutely engaging presentations. I'm sure there will be questions from the audience.
Question for Marta. I was just wondering if you could comment a bit on the techniques that your interviewees had developed for distinguishing genuine news from disinformation or misinformation, whether they feel confident that they're not also recreating their own information bubbles when they apply those techniques, which is one of the risks of sort of an intuitive process of filtering through.
That's an excellent question. I'm afraid I don't have a great answer for you because I would have to go back to that interview and see what they said. There is methodology involved in that. Maybe our colleagues from Ukraine might have more insight into how those types of quantitative studies are happening. It's like how they're asking people about issues of trust. But that's, for me, the most interesting part, right? Like, how do you realize that this is true, this is not true? How do you measure that? And that's hard. I'm sorry, that's the best I can do on that one. But that's the question.
First, I have a question to Martha. You mentioned that they use Telegram for documenting war crimes, for example, but also in the war for documenting troop movements and so on. Have you had any discussions with the people you interviewed on how that transforms actually civilians into combatants and the regulatory framework and how the Geneva Convention applies to them? Also, a question about the chart that you did yesterday. Have you any analysis on why certain Telegram channels dropped so quickly and why these Belarusian or two majors, why they climbed quickly?
The documentation of war crimes is not specifically Telegram. It's various social media platforms, and the way that it works is projects are created, they scrape the data from all the platforms, and then they put it together. The people who are actually thinking in those terms, they're very aware of all the regulations. And again, Natalia who's a journalist, who's the one I spoke to most in detail about this, she said it's very important for us to put together a case that will be able to use in the International Criminal Court. So they are extremely careful in what kind of information they have and what they're doing with it. But they're aggregating, right? So the point is that people who are witnessing things are putting them on the social media, and then other people are taking them and putting them together. But along those lines, another journalist, photojournalist, Yefrem Lukatsky, he said sometimes journalists are not very aware or not as respectful as they should be because they're going for the story. They want to capture something and they want to put it out there quickly, so they're the first ones. And there are cases where the safety of the individual that's being spoken to or photographed are disregarded. So that does occasionally happen as well. I hope that answers your question.
So regarding the question about changes of influencers in that Telegram space, the main point, just to reiterate, the top 10 actors remain consistently stable. It means that it's really hard to break into that information bubble that the Russian state created. But some of the changes we see on the low end, and I mentioned the Belarusian news aggregator as well as the military blogger, those changes sometimes happen because people turn to some of the channels to know what's happening on the front, and some of the military guys actually running those channels. And if they're killed or captured, the channels sometimes go, idled. So that sometimes reflects in the rankings of that. But we are looking forward to studying more those trends, so because we just identify some of them.
I have a question to Anatoly. Are those Telegram channels hold an imminent threat to Canadian democracy, or they just exist and put the pro-Russian narratives for the Russian people?
Going back to some of the early observations that Marta mentioned, not a lot of Canadians using it. We actually run in every other year survey, state of the social media survey, asking Canadians what platforms you're using on. Telegram is not top 10 list for sure, but for us it's more of an early indication of what kind of narratives and who are the actors from the West might be present there, because they do have active accounts on X, on platforms we use here in Canada, on YouTube, so on and so forth. So even though the Telegram as a platform itself doesn't directly impact Canadians, we do find it useful to study those, how Kremlin's narratives propagate.
Professor Gruz, have you ever tried geographic mapping of the users? If you have, can you draw any conclusions from that?
So we are using publicly available data, so there's no geocoded information. One can try to find geocodes from the messages mentioned or pictures shared. We haven't done that. The closest we got to it would be looking at the language. So we look at the Ukrainian language, will be mostly in that pink color. Everything else is Russian, and some of those peripherally channels in English. But if you have some good strategies to look at that geographically, we'd love to chat with you more.
Thank you so much, Professor Gruz. Can you please elaborate a little bit on Telegram groups? How different they are compared to channels, and what are the major topics united people in regards to the war in Ukraine? Thank you.
So channels, again, started by individual, organization, can have set of moderators, and you have, as a user, you can follow the channel, but you have limited ability to interact with that content. You can react to it, like emoji likes and stuff. Depending on moderation, you may be allowed to comment on individual posts, but quite often we see channels block that feature. With the groups, Telegram differentiate two types, groups under 200, and then anything that has more than 200, they call them super groups. But functionalities are the same, so you join the group, there could be updates about air sirens, and people can comment on it, or those, Russians, again. The topics varies, so I haven't seen huge difference between what topic covered in channels versus groups. They're quite, based on the connectivities in this network, it's quite dense. Some of the content posted on channels still ended up to be part of the groups. The only difference is really there are more users engaged in those conversations. As research topic, we don't find those conversations indicative or useful. There's lots of noise, trolling, bots, so we are more interested in looking at those information pathways. Yeah.
I have two questions for Professor Gruz. One is about, you mentioned Russian anti-Kremlin channels, and you said that in this particular example, they were citing Zelensky. Where are they in this graph? Do they cite Ukrainian sources more often? Do they cite pro-Kremlin sources, but they provide critical commentary? How prominent are there? Are there many of them? What's the sort of scale that we're talking about? The second question was, when you were talking about these channels, I sort of remembered that when the attempted coup of PMC Wagner happened, it was announced on Telegram. Can we, through looking at the networks, sort of see the outlines of factions within Russia? And have you sort of studied that? Or is the line maintained universally and there's no deviation from the official line when you're looking at these pro-government channels?
So the first question about those bridging agents that I indicated, some of those alternative media critical of Kremlin but identify as Russians, that's a good subject for future study. Essentially spend a lot of time building the data set, and now we can ask those questions. So if you or somebody else interested in collaborating with us on questions like that, we have the data and network to answer them. Regarding the second question is, the mapping we did over the last 3 years, shows that the network is quite stable, so we don't see major changes. So while some of the narratives slightly can deviate and be more critical, they still tap into the same information network, so we don't see the structure which changes that much. So it could be just some of the channels just trying to be outrageous to gain followers, but in reality, they still getting the message from from RIA News and other central nodes. So I haven't seen those changes indicative in the network.
So the question online is anonymous, and it's, does Telegram continue to maintain all of its servers in Russia?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at the digital infrastructure. Well, like any social media platforms, to run something large like that, you have to have multiple servers around the world. So I don't think they're in Russia.
I would say short answer is no. That's the reality. They have to be diversified.
I have a quick question to Professor Gruz. In your table, you have this top 10 Telegram channels that's been mostly cited. My question is that among this top 10, most of it is just like news sources that are like publishing the most. Did you think about weighting against the number of the posts, so like making the weighted average? Because like RIA News publishes like at least hundreds of times per day or something like that, compared to some mill bloggers who are, some of them are also pretty prolific, but maybe it would make sense to make it weighted. against of their like absolute numbers?
Yeah, so in a way it is weighted. We didn't have time to get into the network analysis part, but we're looking at what it's called in-degree centrality, which measures how many other channels reference you, not necessarily how many times they reposted your content. So it is already weighted for that.
So you mentioned how there's a huge jump at the beginning in terms of people signing up for use with Telegram. And my question is, do you find that there's a decline, especially given with Durov and his relationship to Russia? I mean, his sort of big claim and the reason that those networks were thought to be so open was his reluctance to cooperate with law enforcement. And given that it's so poorly like end-to-end encrypted, like why aren't people using Signal? Why aren't they even using sort of any of the other systems?
Two questions there. First, has there been a decline? Absolutely. A number of reasons. First of all, information overload. Maybe those of us in the room that have been following what's been going on. Initially, I was on the news cycle 24/7, and then there comes a point where you just can't, right? And so that's the same pattern in Ukraine. So there's been a decrease in just people's interest in news. And something, again, some of the respondents were saying that people who had never been interested in news started following the news when that, so that spike has plateaued. Now, why have people continued to use Telegram? Because Telegram continues to be the number one. So overall, there's a decline in usage, but the structure is the same. This is the question I don't have the answer to. That they know that this is Russian-owned, and most people say, yeah, I know that they're probably sharing their data, even though he says he isn't. The owner, Durov, says he isn't, but most people are skeptical about that, and yet they continue to use it. That's the paradox that I need to unpack that a little more and get more people to try to speculate on it. I don't know, maybe you have some thoughts on it. Some people said things like habit, that once you've started using it and that's where your groups are, I find the same. This is a confession moment. I mean, I'm on Twitter. I call it still Twitter. I know I shouldn't stay there, but there are people that I follow on Twitter. So there's a little bit of that dynamic that you get used to a certain mechanism, and the fact that it's easy, it's fast, you can share anything and huge files, and no matter what the conditions are, all those factors play into it. Did I answer all your questions? Okay, thank you.
The second question from Zoom, it's from Arena. Are there any available tools/methods to analyze meta or X narratives? And if so, what are the best practices?
Yes, computational social scientists, we always struggle to get the reliable research data, even publicly available data. The tool used to be called CrowdTangle, that Meta had for researchers and journalists to get that view. Right now, they switched to something called Meta Content Library and Content Library API. You can apply as a researcher, and I believe it's program open to journalists. Then you have to wait. I see my colleague Philip saying it's not open to journalists. Sorry if you're a journalist. Researchers, but only if it's approved, and it took us 4 months to get access to it. So there is limited, unfortunately, opportunities to do that. But at the same time, we see the usage of meta products on decline. So I think it is important to look at other platforms where Canadians or other users are.
I just wanted to say I share your pain at why we're on toxic platforms, right? And I think it's where your community is. And the problem is you just kind of don't want to leave the community, so you're stuck with the platform. But that's all I wanted to say.
My question is, how did you get access? We were waiting more than 4 months, actually, and didn't get any from the Meta. That's the first question. It sounds like a miracle for me. And secondly, do you think Ukrainian government has to block Telegram?
We can compare our notes in terms of how to apply for access. It also depends when you applied, perhaps. There's a queue, because they outsourced the review process. The Meta outsourced to a third entity in the US. So that could be some of the challenges. In terms of should it be regulated, research shows that it is quite a dangerous place, and it's full of Kremlin myths and disinformation. So I certainly see the sentiments and concerns that the Ukrainian government would have about this platform.
Thank you. You asked, should it be banned, not regulated? Right? The process of regulation is happening, and I see that the regulatory framework is going to be adopted soon. The legislation is in place, the actors are all on board. The question is, how do you enforce that? that's problematic. The question about banning, that's a sensitive issue, but I'm going to give you a few things like to think about and then we'll end it. Serhiy Lashchenko pointed out that even regulating anything in the media sector in Ukraine is sensitive, and that's because there have been two periods of censorship, the Kuchma censorship and the Yanukovych censorship. So anytime government officials start talking about regulating anything in the media sector, civil society immediately says censorship, censorship. The other thing that, I can't remember which one of my respondents said, is Poroshenko banned a number of media outlets and social media platforms. Odnoklassniki, VKontakte. He was very strongly criticized, both domestically and internationally, for doing that. A few years went by, and Canada, the US, European countries, they all started banning the same media outlets that Poroshenko had banned in Ukraine. So there's a difference between free speech and hate speech and disinformation. And these are questions that governments need to think about very seriously. I'll just leave it at that. This is a question for you. It's an opinion question. If I understood correctly, you said the #1 Telegram channel in Russia is RIA Novosti. Did I get that right? Okay, now in Ukraine, it's not a media outlet or a government outlet. It is, I can't remember which one it is now because they change, but they're these anonymous Vanyok channels. How do you explain the fact that the Russians will follow the official news, whereas Ukrainians will follow these anonymous but interesting and useful sources?
Well, the data shows that yes, RIA News was #1, but we also saw a lot of military bloggers who are, bloggers, individuals, a group of individuals. So it's a mixed environment, but they are tapping into the same information source. On Ukrainian side, we haven't dived deeper in that pink color Ukrainian cluster, but we also see the mix. What we did see in Kyiv Independence has almost no reposts on Telegram. So that was unfortunate to see. They do posts, though. So that's an example of the question came earlier. They post messages, but nobody reposts them. So, but then you have Zelensky, because of his active use of social media, also playing an important role of information source for that cluster. So I think it's more, this environment is more complex than just to say, traditional media versus bloggers there. But I think like each study of each cluster needs to require a separate paper. So thank you for thinking me about future work.
I can't resist, but actually try to attempt to answer this particular question. Consider a very important differentiation and distinction which currently marks the very status quo of both societies. One is fully under the attack. So Mykolaievsky Vanyok, yes, that's the channel which was the first early on in the war reporting on the incoming attacks. So that certainly had created a traffic. So the informational needs are so different, right? So that's probably me carving into the conversation between the two of you with some observations of mine. And on that very note, we are very, very much on time. Thank you so much for all your wonderful questions and to our presenters.